I was on a sales call, um, and I'm in my groove and I'm talking, and one of my one of my prospects says, "I don't mean to interrupt you, but you have a monster on your head," and he said it just like that. And okay, and I wiped it off, and it was a giant hornet, and I freaked out a little bit, and I guess that disturbed the hive, who then proceeded to attack me while I was on my sales call. So I very quickly hung up. I said, "I'll call you back," and I ran out as I was getting stung. So that was fun.
Welcome to Outbound, where we talk about strategies and tactics to help you build deeper relationships with your ideal customers. Today on the show, I have David Mussan-Levy with me. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Do you mind telling our listeners just a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So I have been in sales for about 15 years, maybe a little over. Currently, I work for a company called Synechron, and I'm director of sales there. Synechron's a professional services organization focused on financial services, selling IT consulting services.
Awesome. And David, what's your secret sauce for building relationships with your ideal customers?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to make everything personal, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that starts with research. It's really important to bring value, and it's really important to be tenacious. Making sure that you understand your customers, what's important to them, and never giving up.
So what does that look like in practice for you to be building, to be personalizing? Because I hear that a lot, and then depending on who you're following on different sales channels, that might be like, say the title of the company that they work for, and make sure you're using the right tokens in your email so that it's got their name in there. So what do you mean by personalizing and the value of doing that?
So that yes, if you ask 10 people, you probably get 12 different answers about what personalizing mean. To me, it means, and I jokingly refer to it as stalking my prospects, right? I want to follow them on all of their social media platforms, LinkedIn, on Twitter. I want to understand what is important to them. What are they posting? What groups are they in on LinkedIn, right? Maybe they just posted about a personal milestone like a marathon or something. I want to understand everything that they're kind of doing, and I want to use that as an icebreaker, right? So I want to understand what's important to them, what what kind of things make them tick professionally. If they have something that they've posted personally, that could be a great icebreaker as well.
So tell me about a time when doing that personalization or doing that the stalking somebody from your ideal customers. What does that look like in practice?
So I joke when I say stalking. Don't folks listening, don't actually stalk your prospects. I promise. So I was tasked with growing an account. It was a big bank here in New York City, and I made sure that I knew which elevator the C-level executive got on in the mornings. And every time I was in the building, I tried to make sure that I was in that elevator before him, or just around when he was going to be getting there. And we would just ride the elevator and we would have, quick chat. How's it going? Talk about the weather. And then we started to get to know each other a little bit. Oh, hey, I remember you. And then we start having conversations. And then slowly, it guided the conversation towards something more business related. And it took time, right? But by the end of it, he said, "Hey, thank you for being so persistent. It was, this was important. And I appreciate your tenacity."
Yeah, so something that I'm kind of curious about. So you're talking about personalization and really understanding personalizing, and then to the point where you're making sure that you're ending up on the elevator with this executive, and being able to communicate. You're having this great dialogue and rapport. When do you decide it's the right point to go from that more conversational relationship building to really turning it into more of a focused business conversation or asking for a discovery call? How do you determine when the right point is to do that?
I try to let them guide the conversation, right? So when you walk up to somebody at a bar and you want to meet somebody new, uh, you don't walk up and you start talking about yourself, right? You walk up and you start asking them questions about what they do, about who they are, and at some point, the person you're talking to is going to say, "Well, what do you do?" Right? It's only natural to have that kind of response. Then so I try to let them just guide the conversation, whether that's over email, whether that's over LinkedIn message, whether that's in person. Um, I typically let them try to guide that.
Okay, David, I'm gonna ask you a question that wasn't on there, and if you don't want to go this route or you don't have something that comes to mind, um, then no worries. But do you have an example? So it's one thing if you can go in person and you're going on the elevator and you're able to meet somebody and you can build that rapport over time. Um, what does it look like to create that level of personalization if you're not able to get in front of the person on a regular basis like that? Like, what does it look like for you through phone or email or LinkedIn?
Sure. I tend to use LinkedIn kind of exclusively with some phone calls sprinkled in, but I have a lengthy process that I've developed over time. It used to be a 15 touch process, and over time that's evolved because of the nature of the way sales has evolved. Um, but it starts, again, with doing your research, understanding the groups that they're in, understanding what makes them tick, and then it could just be something as simple as, "Hey, I heard, XYZ company had a great quarter. Congratulations." And just continuing that dialogue. And it might take 10 or 15, 20 messages before they respond back, but eventually that they will, right? As long as you don't make it like, "Oh, Synechron does XYZ, and I think it would be really important for you to learn about that." Like they're not going to care, right?
Just looking for 15 minutes on your calendar.
Yeah, I'm
Here's
just
my
looking,
scheduling link. When are you
give
going
me
to
seven and
schedule?
a half minutes of your time and it will change your world.
No, that's really practical. I like that. I like that distinction, and you're really letting the customer lead to a degree, but you're just consistently showing up. So in a sense, it's like personalization is figuring out what's important to them, starting conversations, and then just consistently showing up over and over and over again until they can't ignore you anymore.
Yes, I had a teacher in college tell me once 80% of life is showing up, and that stuck with me.
So what are some practical steps that somebody listening to the show could take to start developing that approach to be more personalized and persistent?
Sure. So, I mean, I already started talking about research. Research is really, really critical. Making sure that you are uh, following the groups that your prospects are in. Well, I guess making sure understanding who your prospects are, right? We'll assume that that's a given, that you know who your prospects are. Following their social media pages, following their LinkedIn groups, and seeing what is important to them. Are they in a specific work group for maybe agile software development practices? Do they care about data? These are things that are important to my world, but every prospect is probably in some kind of group, or they have some kind of interest on their LinkedIn. Follow that, use that as a starter. um, Something else that's really critical is making sure that you understand the value that you're bringing to every meeting. I tell my folks, sell the meeting, understand what is important, or what the measure of success is for each meeting, whether that's an introductory meeting, a conversation where you're talking about a proposal, or a scoping meeting, or talking about negotiations. Understand what the measure of success is for you and for your client, and make sure that you're selling that value at each meeting. And then, finally, it's just being tenacious. It's following up. The way people buy has changed so significantly from when I started working in sales. When I started working in sales, it was smile and dial. People were waiting to hear back, to hear from us about new products and services, and that's not how people buy today. By the time we talk to people, it changes every time I look, but I think they're 60% of the way through their buying process at this point, right? Um, and they're inundated with salespeople trying to get their attention. And I think that if you are tenacious and following up with them and you don't drop off within your sales outreach process, I think that's really going to help. That's really going to help drive business. And the final thing is just a quick way that you can shift your outbound process. When what most salespeople do is they start off strong, calling, emailing, sending LinkedIn messages, sending Twitter messages, sending smoke signals, whatever it is that they do. But as they don't get a response, they tend to drop off in their cadence. They start reaching out less, and eventually they send some version of breakup email like, "Hey, is this important? If not, I'll go away." Um, and that sends a signal that what you're calling about isn't important because it's dropping off in intensity. So what salespeople can do is they can start off maybe a little bit of a slower burn, and they can ratchet up that intensity and that cadence. And that sends a subtle change or subtle signal to the person you're reaching out to. And that says, you know what, whatever this person's trying to contact me about, they think it's important. So maybe I should answer them, see what this is all about.
Yeah. So having been on the receiving end of some people who can be extremely tenacious, but they're not necessarily connecting with something that I feel is important enough to take time to respond and go through that. Um, I think that there's an impression of salespeople, and even when in my outreach, it probably makes. I would say that I would tend to be not persistent enough because I've been on the other end where you're like, okay, this is kind of getting annoying at this point, and leave me alone. So when you're working through that process, how what have you come to as like the fine line? Because at a certain point, you're in sales. If you're doing outreach, you're going to annoy somebody at a certain point in time. I mean, and you're probably, I mean, even with prospects, you're probably going to annoy them at some point through the process. So maybe part of it is just recognizing that you're going to be a little bit of annoying, but you're doing it to serve them because what you have is helpful. But then, how do you personally determine where that line is between being persistent and then, just being obnoxious and almost self focused at that point?
I try to time box it within X amount of time, and that's, I'm going to predetermine that, and it's going to be a little different for each organization. It's a little bit of an art, right? Which is not very helpful, but you just pick it up over time. You learn what works and what doesn't for different companies and different organizations. But you start with time boxing it, whether it's 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, whatever it is. And within that time frame, you want to get to a no as quickly as possible. I want somebody to tell me to go away, right? Say, this isn't for me, not right now, no thank you. Great. So I know how to allocate my time. But if I don't hear back, then I'm going to assume that they're just busy, and they they're just busy, or they haven't looked at it. And there are ways that you can track, there are different tools out there. You can track who's opening things, who's engaging with your emails and whatnot.
Okay, so that's helpful. So yeah, and I think having been on the marketing side pretty heavily through most of my career, I've done sales at different points in time, but I kind of tend to be more on the side of like uh, trying to not spam people as much as I can and not do that. And I think this is a helpful conversation. I think it's important for salespeople to recognize what you're talking about, where it's like it is actually serving the person on the other end to be persistent if it is a problem. If you believe that the problem is something that they should solve, and you believe that what you have is going to really help them do that effectively, then by being persistent, you're helping to make something a priority for them that they might not realize should be a priority. And then, by reaching out to them consistently, because I mean, sometimes it's true. Sometimes somebody's just busy and they're like, oh, that was really important. I'll get back to that later today. And then you forget about it. And if the person never reaches up, you just forget about it and move on. And then you're dealing with the pain or consequence later on because you didn't deal with it effectively. Anyway, I appreciate your perspective on that. That's helpful.
Well, thank you. Another example of where that's worked. I was working with a large financial services organization, and the initial outreach was in like August of 2019 or 2020. I forget now. But it took literally 24 months to get this closed from initial contact to closed because, or I should say from initial outreach to closed because just they were busy, right? And by the end of it, they were like, "Well, thank you for staying up with us." And it was, "Hey, we don't have time to explore this. It's important, but we want to review it." But that, I didn't get to that point until after 6 months of outreach and reaching out. And yeah, at some point you taper off and you just say, "You know what, I'll reach out to them next month and see if they have any bandwidth to review this now."
Yeah, that I think that's a good perspective and good way to balance that. And yeah, just through it. I think the main difference between what you're sharing about and some of the things that we see that get to be obnoxious is when people are looking to personalize something just enough to get somebody's attention so that they can pitch them, right? Whereas if we take what you just said about, hey, look, we're going to be persistent, we're going to, really be driving towards this because it's valuable for them and it's something that they need, but you're doing it from that place of building personal connection, building trust up front, doing that research so you really know that you are adding value and you know that they are at a point where they need it because you've done the research and you're connecting those dots. So I think that's a really key thing to pull together from what you said too, is just tying all of those different pieces together. Because if you're being persistent like that but it's not personalized and it's not relevant and it's not timely, then it is just annoying, right?
Then it is just annoying. Absolutely. Sales is equal parts persistence and luck, right? The person on the other end has to be in a position to buy, right? And sometimes you're lucky and they are, and sometimes you're not, and you just miss budget season or whatever the case may be, right? So it's just being tenacious, keeping that conversation open and saying, "Okay, well, when you're ready, I'm here, and in the meantime, I'm going to share content that I think is important to you," right?
So what's the wildest thing that's ever happened to you in your sales career?
Yeah, so I was attacked by hornets, and I don't know if you've never seen a hornet, and I'm not talking like the giant murder hornets. If you've never seen a hornet, they are really big. They look like yellow jackets who are just jerks with stingers, but they look like yellow jackets, just proportionally larger, maybe half the size of a thumb drive, right? They're really really big. We just bought a house maybe 2 years ago, and the house is a bit of a fixer upper, and it's really poorly sealed. So one of the first things we did was we changed out all the windows. But before we did that, I was on a sales call, and I'm in my groove and I'm talking, and one of my prospects says, "I don't mean to interrupt you, but you have a monster on your head," and he said it just like that. And okay, and I wiped it off, and it was a giant hornet, and I freaked out a little bit, and I guess that disturbed the hive, who then proceeded to attack me while I was on my sales call. So I very quickly hung up. I said, "I'll call you back," and I ran out as I was getting stung. So that was fun.
That is a crazy story. um, Not something that you're going to run into every day on a sales call, getting stung
That
by
is not
hornets.
something you're going to run into every day. Well, I certainly hope not. And if it is, maybe you should reevaluate your life choices.
Or at least the location that you're taking your
That's
sales calls from.
100%.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Where can people find more about you and what you're up to?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's just linkedin.com/David Mussan-Levy. And I am on Twitter as well. And I think it's DevOps Dave on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, if you enjoyed this show, I'd really appreciate it if you leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us out. And we'll see you next time on Outbound.
That's great. Thanks, everybody.